Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we will delve into the deep shadows of Appalachia. Let us know in the comments where you are watching us from right now. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It is the year 1869. The Civil War still echoes in the memory of Tennessee residents, and the wounds opened by the conflict remain sensitive. In the Appalachian Mountains, where the morning mist clings to the pines like ghosts reluctant to leave, there are valleys so deep that the sun takes hours to reach the forest floor. It is in this isolated setting, where entire communities live separated by miles of winding trails, that our story begins. The region known as the Cumberland Plateau stretches for hundreds of kilometers, marked by ancient rock formations and dense forests that seem to hold stories from the beginning of time. Locals depend on hunting, fishing in icy streams, and small farms that struggle against the rocky soil. Life here is hard, lonely, and the nearest neighbors can be a half-day's walk away. There's no telegraph at these heights, no sheriff arriving before nightfall. Here, each family lives by its own rules, protected only by the silent vastness of the mountain. It was in this complete isolation that the first mention of the property known only as the House of the Six Candles appeared. The name first appeared in Cumberland County records, notes made by an itinerant merchant who traveled the trails selling fabrics, tools, and news from the outside world. He mentioned a dark wooden building, erected atop a rise where the wind constantly howled, as if the mountain itself were weeping. The house stood at the end of a road that looked more like a dry stream bed, surrounded by twisted trees that grew at strange angles, as if something on the ground prevented them from rising straight towards the sky. The merchant described a middle-aged man with grey hair and a penetrating gaze, who lived there with 6 young women. He called them his sisters, although to passers-by there was something unsettling about the dynamics of that family. The young women rarely spoke, kept their eyes downcast, and disappeared into the house at the slightest sign of visitors. The man, in turn, was cordial but firm, always blocking the entrance with his broad body, as if protecting something too precious or dangerous to be seen. What intrigued the merchant most, and would later become the most disturbing detail of this entire narrative, was the candle ritual. Every night, without exception, 6 candles were lit in each of the house's windows. Not 5, not 7, always 6. And they burned until dawn, casting a yellowish, ghostly light that could be seen from the main path, even miles away. When questioned about the reason, the man smiled strangely and replied only that each light represented a soul under his protection. Months passed, and other travelers began to report similar experiences. One hunter mentioned hearing songs coming from the property in the early morning hours, harmonious female voices, but the words were incomprehensible, almost like an ancient lament in a forgotten language. Another visitor swore he saw figures moving behind the torn curtains, shadows dancing erratically, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. But no one dared investigate further. In those mountains, the unwritten rule was clear: everyone takes care of their own, and what happens inside private property is not the business of strangers. The spring of 1870 brought subtle but unsettling changes to that forgotten region of the Appalachians. The streams flowing down from the mountains ran more turbid than usual, and the forest animals seemed to completely avoid the vicinity of the property. Experienced hunters, men who knew every trail and every sound of those woods, began to report something strange. An absolute silence hung over that specific area. No birds, no rustling of small rodents. Only the cutting wind and the constant creaking of the old wooden building. It was around this time that a family of newly arrived settlers from Virginia decided to settle a few miles away. The Morrisons were simple, honest, hard-working people seeking to start over after losing everything in the war. The patriarch, a man named Samuel Morrison, was a carpenter by trade and soon offered to help his neighbors in the area with repairs and construction. That's how he ended up being called to that house on the hilltop. Samuel left one morning in April, taking his tools with him and the promise to return before nightfall. His wife saw him disappear down the misty trail, and that was the last time anyone in the Morrison family saw him alive. He didn't return that night, nor the next. When he finally reappeared 3 days later, Samuel Morrison was a changed man. His eyes held a blank expression, as if he had witnessed something his mind refused to fully process. He could barely articulate coherent words. repeating only disjointed phrases about doors that shouldn't be opened and rooms where candlelight revealed truths that should remain hidden. Samuel's wife sought out the local pastor, an elderly man named Josiah Blackwood, who served several communities scattered throughout the mountains. The pastor was known for his wisdom and for keeping detailed records of events in the region in a well-worn leather-bound diary. He was the first to systematically document the events related to the House of the Six Candles, creating what would now be considered the only reliable historical record of those dark days. Blackwood decided to visit the property personally. He believed that his position as a man of faith would grant him access and answers. One afternoon in May, accompanied by two respected members of the community, the pastor climbed up to the isolated house. What they found there was recorded in his diary in meticulous detail. The building was in poor condition, with loose boards and parts of the roof visibly damaged. But most disturbing was the atmosphere of the place. The air seemed heavier, difficult to breathe, and a sweet, nauseating odor emanated from some undefined point in the structure. The man who went by the name of Ezekiel Thorne greeted them on the porch. His appearance had deteriorated since the last reports. His hair was now completely white, his hands trembling, but his eyes still retained that intense and unsettling gleam. He categorically refused any entry into the house, claiming that the sisters were unwell and could not receive visitors. When the pastor asked directly about the girl's state of health, Thorne simply smiled and replied that they were exactly where they needed to be, fulfilling the purpose for which they had been chosen. It was then that one of the pastor's companions noticed something alarming. Through a crack in the boards of the side wall, it was possible to see the interior of one of the rooms, and there, lined up against the wall, were 6 narrow beds, each occupied by a motionless figure covered in white sheets stained by time. Candles burned on pedestals beside each bed, their flames flickering slightly even without any apparent wind. There was no movement, no sign of life in those forms beneath the fabrics, only the heavy silence and the hypnotic dance of the 6 identical flames. The group retreated immediately, and Pastor Blackwood noted in his diary that he felt at that moment a profound and terrifying certainty. Something deeply wrong inhabited that house, something that defied his understanding of the world and his faith. They descended the mountain in silence, but the image of those 6 beds and the eternally burning candles would remain etched in their memories until the end of their days. That summer arrived, bringing with it a sweltering heat that made the mountain air even denser and more oppressive. Communities scattered throughout the Tennessee valleys began whispering amongst themselves, sharing fragmented stories about the cursed property atop the hill. Pastor Blackwood attempted to arrange a meeting with Cumberland County authorities, but the distance and lack of clear jurisdiction in that remote region made any official intervention virtually impossible. Furthermore, technically, no crime had been reported, only suspicions, uneasy feelings, and accounts from concerned neighbors. During the warmer months, activity in the house seemed to decrease. Candles were still lit every night, but Ezekiel Thorne was rarely seen outside. Some residents reported passing by the property during the day and finding it utterly silent, as if the house were completely uninhabited. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of meals being prepared, no movement at the dusty windows. It was as if time had frozen in that particular place, while the rest of the world continued its inexorable march. It was in August that the incident that would change everything occurred. A fabric merchant named Martha Henley, known for her courage and independence unusual for a woman of that time, decided to confront Ezekiel Thorne directly. Martha had lost a niece years before, a young woman who disappeared without a trace while traveling through the mountains, and something in the description of the 6 women in the house had aroused in her a persistent and painful suspicion. She went up to the property on a clear afternoon, determined to get answers. The confrontation lasted for hours. Neighbors who lived miles away reported hearing screams coming from that direction, distorted voices carried by the wind. Martha Henley descended from the mountain at nightfall, visibly shaken but alive. She refused to speak about what she had witnessed inside the house, saying only that some truths were too heavy to share. But she made a statement that chilled the blood of all who heard it. The 6 women were still there, but not in the way anyone would expect to find them. She didn't elaborate, didn't give details, only repeated that the candles had a far darker purpose than anyone could imagine. After that visit, Martha wrote an urgent letter to the sheriff's office in Crossville, the nearest town with any law enforcement. The letter took weeks to arrive, and several more weeks before anyone decided to act. In October, finally, a group of 4 men set off for the mountains. Among them were a law enforcement officer, 2 community volunteers, and a doctor who had agreed to accompany the expedition in case it became necessary to assess anyone's health. The journey to the house took 2 full days of riding along precarious trails. When they finally sighted the building atop the hill, the sun was already beginning to set, tinging the sky with orange and violet hues. The house seemed even more sinister under that twilight light, its windows as dark as empty sockets in an ancient skull. But something was different. The candles weren't lit. For the first time since the first reports began to circulate, the windows remained completely dark, even as night fell. The group approached cautiously, their weapons drawn not in anticipation of confrontation, but out of instinctive fear of the unknown. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze. A sharp, constant creaking came from within, the sound of old wood protesting against its own weight. The law enforcement officer called out loudly, identifying himself and requesting permission to enter. No answer came, only thick silence and that endless creaking. They entered. The interior of the house was bathed in twilight, illuminated only by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. The sweet smell that had been described earlier was present, but now mixed with something more earthy, deeper. The doctor immediately recognized that odor and gestured for the others to cover their noses and mouths. It was the smell of decomposition, but not recent. It was the aroma of something that had begun to break down long ago, somehow unnaturally preserved by the enclosed environment and the specific conditions of that altitude. In the main room, exactly as the pastor had described months before, were the 6 beds lined up. The white sheets were now yellowed with age. The candlesticks, now extinguished, had been dripping wax for so long that they formed whitish mounds on the wooden floor, and above each bed, those motionless, silent forms waiting for something that might never come. The doctor was the first to approach the beds, his professional training momentarily overcoming the fear that paralyzed the other men. He carefully touched one of the sheets, feeling the stiff texture of the aged fabric. With trembling hands, he slowly began to pull back the covers of the first bed, mentally preparing himself for what he might find. The other members of the group held their flashlights, projecting dancing shadows onto the peeling walls of the room. What was revealed at that moment defied any logical explanation. Beneath the sheet were not human bodies, but rather elaborate constructions made of branches, fabrics, human hair, and other materials that had been carefully arranged to form female silhouettes. They were like life-size dolls, created with an attention to detail bordering on obsession. Each one had distinct features as if representing specific people. Antique dresses covered the structures, some clearly belonging to different eras, varied styles suggesting decades of collection. The law enforcement officer ordered them to check the other 5 beds. All contained similar creations, each unique in its details, each seemingly representing a different woman. There were jewels hanging from some, medallions with faded portraits, handkerchiefs embroidered with initials that meant nothing to the men present. It was like a bizarre shrine, a memorial to people who perhaps never existed or who had disappeared so long ago that their memories were lost in the folds of time. But the most disturbing discovery was on the pedestals beside each bed. Beneath each candle holder were small hand-carved wooden plaques. On them were female names followed by dates: Sarah, 1847, Elizabeth, 1852, Catherine, 1856, Margaret, 1861, Rebecca, 1864, and the last one, still without a date engraved, just a name, Caroline. The dates did not correspond to declared births or deaths, but seemed to mark some kind of arrival or significant event in Ezekiel Thorne's life. The men began to explore the rest of the house, their footsteps echoing on the empty floorboards. They found a kitchen virtually untouched for months, with rusty pots and pans and food scraps reduced to dust. A small office contained piles of yellowed papers, unsent letters, old newspaper clippings about women who had disappeared in different states over the years. There was also a diary, written in shaky but legible handwriting, where Thorne documented her thoughts in fragmented and disturbing entries. The pages spoke of a devastating loss that had occurred decades earlier, of 6 sisters, whom he loved deeply and who had departed this life in tragic and distinct ways. He described how the pain of their absence had become unbearable, how he couldn't accept that they were gone forever. Later entries became increasingly confused, mixing real memories with elaborate fantasies. He wrote about keeping them alive through rituals, about how the lit candles represented their souls still present, still under his protection. What was most unsettling were the recent entries, dated just a few weeks earlier. Thorne wrote about finally understanding that his time was running out, that he could no longer keep the flames burning forever. He mentioned having decided to leave that place that had become both a home and a prison, but he promised that the sisters would never be alone, that their presence would remain in that house forever, guarded by the shadows of the mountains and the silence of the Appalachians. The group searched every room, every dark corner of the building, but found no sign of Ezekiel Thorne. He had simply vanished, taking with him only the mystery of who those 6 women represented by the figures on the beds really were. Were they his real sisters? Were they women he had known throughout his life? Or were they entirely creations of his tormented mind, ghosts of people who perhaps never existed in the way he described them? When night had completely fallen, the men decided not to remain on the property. There was something in the air of that place that made it impossible to relax, a constant feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. They camped at a safe distance, planning to return at dawn for a more thorough investigation. During the night, while keeping watch around the campfire, they all swore they had seen a faint light flickering in the windows of the abandoned house on the hilltop, a yellowish, ghostly light, as if someone had relit the 6 candles, defying the darkness once more. Dawn arrived, bringing with it a thick fog that completely engulfed the Appalachian landscape. The men waited until visibility improved before returning to the property, but the mist seemed to have a life of its own, refusing to dissipate even with the sun high in the sky. When they finally approached the house again, they found the door they had left ajar now completely closed, as if someone had been there during the night to tidy things up. This time, the exploration was more methodical and time-consuming. The doctor carefully examined the figures on the beds, trying to determine how long those constructions had been there. From the deterioration of the tissues and the way the materials had fused together over time, he estimated that some of those representations could be decades old. It was as if Thorne had spent years, perhaps his entire life, creating and maintaining that peculiar sanctuary. In the attic of the house, accessible only by a narrow and unstable staircase, they found old trunks filled with women's belongings. Dresses carefully folded, some clearly dating from 1840, others more recent. There were also yellowed letters, faded photographs where serious faces stared at the camera with that characteristic rigidity of early photographic techniques, and personal objects such as hairbrushes, still containing strands of hair stuck in the bristles. Hand mirrors with silver frames stained by time. One of the volunteers found a smaller box, hidden under a loose floorboard. Inside, official documents began to tell a clearer story. Death certificates dated 1843, all issued in the state of North Carolina, all referring to women of the Thorne family. A typhoid fever epidemic had devastated that region that year, wiping out entire communities in a matter of weeks. Among the victims were 6 sisters of Ezekiel Thorne, all deceased within a span of just 15 days. The documents revealed that Ezekiel was the eldest brother, 23 years old at the time of the tragedy. He had been the sole survivor of the family, inexplicably spared by the illness, while watching his sisters waste away one after another. Local parish records mentioned that after the burials, Ezekiel disappeared without a trace, abandoning the family property and all his possessions. No one heard from him for years until his name resurfaced decades later, associated with a remote property in the Tennessee mountains. Now, looking at those dates carved into the pedestals, everything began to make a terrible and melancholic sense. The dates didn't mark deaths, but rather the years in which Thorne had created each of those representations. It was his way of bringing them back, of rebuilding the family that fever had stolen from him. Each figure was a sister, each candle a life he refused to let go out in the darkness of oblivion. The law enforcement officer spent hours examining newspaper clippings found in the office. There were dozens of them, collected over the years, all reporting the disappearances of young women in different parts of the country. Initially, this had raised terrible suspicions about what Thorne might have done. But closer analysis revealed something different and equally disturbing. The clippings were old, some dating back to before the Civil War. Thorne wasn't collecting trophies of crime, but rather desperately searching for his sisters, unable to accept that they were truly gone. In his mind, fragmented by grief, he seemed to believe that his sisters were still alive somewhere, lost, needing to be found and brought back home. The clippings were clues he followed, hopes he pursued, believing that each missing woman could be one of his sisters returning. It was a futile and tragic search that had consumed decades of his existence. The diary contained entries that alternated between moments of painful lucidity, where Thorne acknowledged the reality of his sister's deaths, and periods of delirium, where he wrote entire conversations he claimed to have had with them that very morning. He described preparing meals for 6 people, making their beds, combing their hair. In his absolute solitude in those isolated mountains, the line between memory and present had completely dissolved. The last diary entry, dated late September of that year, 1870, was particularly poignant. Thorne wrote about finally feeling peace, about understanding that the time had come to reunite with his true sisters. He mentioned the mountains calling to him, the deep valleys offering rest. There were no threats, no violence in his words, only weariness, only the weight of decades carrying a pain that never healed. The men left the house late in the afternoon, taking with them the documents and records that would help piece together the complete puzzle of that dark story. The decision was made not to disturb the figures in the beds, to leave them exactly as Thorne had arranged them, not out of fear or superstition, but out of a strange respect for that expression of grief and madness intertwined. The weeks that followed the discovery brought more questions than answers to the communities scattered throughout the Tennessee valleys. Pastor Blackwood, still keeping meticulous records, began compiling all available information about Ezekiel Thorne and his tragic story. He interviewed everyone who had had any kind of contact with the man over the years, piecing together a fragmented portrait of a life consumed by loss and the inability to move on. Martha Henley, the courageous tradeswoman who had confronted Thorne months before, finally agreed to share the details of her visit. Seated in the modest parsonage room, a trembling teacup in her hands, she described the encounter in a way that made everyone present feel a mixture of sadness and unease. Thorne had received her with a strange, almost rehearsed cordiality, as if he were playing the role of host to visitors who existed only in his imagination. He had invited her in, something he had never done with any other visitor, and led her to the room with the 6 beds. There he introduced each of the figures by name, telling elaborate stories about their personalities, their tastes, their dreams. Sarah loved music and often sang at dusk. Elizabeth was the most studious, always with a book in her hands. Catherine had a talent for sewing and had made all the dresses that were still stored in the trunks. Margaret was the most adventurous, always wanting to explore the forests around the family property. Rebecca was kind and cared for everyone when they were sick, and Caroline, the youngest, was the dreamer, always gazing at the stars and imagining distant worlds. Martha described how Thorne spoke to each figure as if they could hear him, carefully adjusting the sheets, straightening a stray strand of hair, lighting the candles with the reverence of someone performing a sacred ritual. He explained that the flames needed to burn continuously because each one represented the spiritual presence of a sister. If the candles went out, he believed, their souls would be lost in the darkness, unable to find their way back home. What disturbed Martha most was not the eccentricity of Thorne's behavior, but rather the depth of his conviction. He truly believed that his sisters were there with him, that the house was a living, pulsating home. He mentioned recent conversations, shared meals, laughter echoing through the empty hallways. In his mind, time had folded back on itself, creating a reality where 1843 and 1870 coexisted in the same space, where death and life were not opposing concepts, but rather states that could be negotiated through willpower and unwavering devotion. When Martha gently tried to confront him with reality, suggesting that perhaps it was time to let the past rest, Thorne had a reaction that deeply frightened her. There was no anger or violence, but rather a moment of clarity so intense and painful that she could see the truth reflected in his eyes. For a few seconds, perhaps minutes, he truly understood where he was and what he had become. The mask of illusion fell, and what remained was an old and exhausted man, carrying the weight of decades of loneliness and denial. He sat heavily in a nearby chair and began to speak of those terrible 15 days of 1843, how each morning brought news that another sister had succumbed to the fever, how he felt powerless, watching them waste away, unable to do anything to save them, how the local doctor had given up after the 3rd death, saying there was nothing more to be done except wait for the epidemic to run its natural course, how he had dug 6 graves in 3 days, his hands bleeding, his heart breaking with each handful of earth he threw onto the simple wooden coffins. Thorne told Martha about the months that followed, how he tried to continue living on the family property in North Carolina. But each room echoed with memories that grew more unbearable each day. He heard voices calling his name, saw shadows in the corners of his eyes, felt presences in rooms he knew were empty. Neighbors began to avoid him, whispering that the tragedy had broken his mind. He sold the property for a fraction of its value and disappeared into the mountains, seeking a place where he could be alone with his grief. It was high in the Appalachian Mountains, where the civilized world seemed distant and unreal, that he finally found a way to cope with the loss. He built the house with his own hands, each plank placed with the intention of creating a sanctuary, a place where his sisters could exist again, even if only in his imagination and through those carefully constructed representations. It wasn't madness in the sense of endangering others, Martha understood, but rather an extreme form of grief that had crystallized into ritual. He began collecting objects that reminded him of his sisters. He visited distant cities, participated in property auctions, bought dresses that would never be worn, jewelry that would never adorn living necks. Each item was carefully chosen, imagining which of his sisters would appreciate it most. The trunks in the attic were testaments to decades of collecting, each piece carrying a story, a memory, a connection to the past that he refused to let go of. Thorne also revealed something to Martha that no one else knew. In the first years after the tragedy, he had tried to rebuild his life. He met a woman in Virginia, a kind person who seemed to understand his pain. They even planned a wedding, but on the eve of the ceremony, he ran away. He couldn't bear the idea of creating new connections when he hadn't yet processed his past losses. The guilt of being alive when his sisters had died consumed him, making it impossible to accept any form of happiness or peace. The newspaper clippings about missing women were, he admitted, a manifestation of his inability to accept mortality. Every time he read about someone who had vanished without a trace, a part of him wanted to believe there was a chance, however small, that his sisters weren't really dead, that perhaps it had been a mistake, a mix-up, and that they were out there somewhere waiting to be found. It was irrational, he knew, but the human heart rarely follows logic when it's broken. Martha said she stayed in that house for hours, listening to Thorne pour out his feelings of decades of loneliness and torment. When he finally left at dusk, he was lighting the 6 candles again, but this time with a different expression on his face. It was no longer the look of someone lost in delirium, but rather of someone fulfilling one last duty, honoring a promise he had made long ago to himself and to the memories he carried. Pastor Blackwood recorded every word of Martha's testimony, recognizing that he was documenting not merely a case of isolated eccentricity in the mountains, but a profound meditation on the human nature of loss, grief, and the inability of some souls to find peace after devastating tragedies. That house high in the Appalachians was not just a construction of wood and nails, but a monument to brotherly love and the fragility of the human mind when confronted with intolerable loss. The winter months arrived early in that year of 1870, covering the Appalachian Mountains with a thick layer of snow that further isolated the communities scattered throughout the valleys. The house atop the hill remained abandoned, its dark windows staring at the silent, white horizon. No one dared climb up there during those frigid months, when the trails became impassable and the biting mountain wind could freeze an unprepared man in a matter of hours. It was during this period that Pastor Blackwood decided to expand his investigation beyond the borders of Tennessee. He sent letters to parishes in North Carolina, seeking any additional information about the Thorne family and the events of 1843. The replies took weeks to arrive, carried by mail across icy roads, but each one brought new fragments of the story that helped to better understand the man Ezekiel had become. An elderly pastor from a small town called Wilkesboro responded with astonishing detail. He remembered the Thorne family clearly, having been called upon to conduct the 6 funeral services during those devastating days of March 1843. He described Ezekiel as a strong, hard-working young man, adored by his sisters, who saw him as their protector and provider since the untimely death of their parents years earlier. The responsibility of caring for 6 young women during such a difficult time had forged in him an almost paternal sense of duty. The pastor recalled how Ezekiel had pleaded for any treatment, any medicine that could save his sisters. He brought doctors from neighboring towns, spent all the family's savings on medications that proved useless against the relentless fever. In the final days, when it was clear there was no hope, He simply sat beside their beds, holding each sister's hand as they passed away, promising that he would never forget them, that he would never leave them alone. The letter also mentioned something no one in Tennessee knew. After the burials, Ezekiel spent 3 days and 3 nights in the local cemetery, refusing to leave the graves. Locals brought him food and blankets, but he barely touched anything. He just sat there talking to the tombstones as if his sisters could still hear him. On the 4th day, when he finally agreed to return home, he was a different man. The sparkle had faded from his eyes, replaced by a distance, as if part of him had been buried along with his sisters. Another response came from a county archive in North Carolina, sending copies of property records. They revealed that the Thorne family farm had been sold in April 1844, more than a year after the deaths. The buyer reported to the clerk that he found the property in a state of disrepair, as if it had been suddenly abandoned. There were rotten meals on the table, clothes scattered about, personal belongings left behind. But strangest of all the family portraits had been removed from the walls, leaving only lighter rectangular patches where the frames used to be. This information shed new light on the trunks found in the attic of the Tennessee house. Thorne had taken with him everything he could carry of his sisters' memories, building a portable archive of their lives that would eventually find a new home in the isolated mountains. Each photograph, each dress, each personal object was a piece of a puzzle he was trying to piece together, recreating the world that typhoid fever had destroyed. Samuel Morrison, the carpenter who had visited the house months before and returned deeply disturbed, finally agreed to speak about his experience in more detail. In January 1871, during a meeting at the local church, he described what he had actually witnessed that day, which had changed his perception of reality. Thorne had hired him to repair some loose floorboards in the attic, a simple job that should have taken only a few hours. While he worked, Samuel could hear Thorne walking through the rooms below, talking loudly. But it wasn't a monologue. He paused as if listening to replies, laughed at jokes only he could hear, agreed with opinions expressed by silent voices. At one point, Samuel heard the sound of plates being placed on a table, followed by Thorne announcing that dinner was served. Curious and slightly worried, the carpenter went downstairs to check. What he found was Thorne sitting at the dining table, alone, but with 7 plates neatly arranged. He ate slowly, pausing between each bite to look at the empty chairs around him, smiling and nodding as if participating in a lively conversation. When he noticed Samuel in the doorway, Thorne invited him to join them, gesturing to an empty chair and introducing him to his sisters, calling each one by name and describing where they were seated around the invisible table. Samuel admitted that the moment had deeply shaken him. There was no threat or danger in the scene, only a profound loneliness and a denial of reality so complete that it seemed to contaminate the very air. He finished the job quickly and descended the mountain, but for days he felt as if the boundary between the real world and the world that existed only in Thorne's mind had become dangerously thin in that place. Winter also brought strange tales from hunters who occasionally ventured near the abandoned property. Some swore they had seen smoke rising from the chimney on particularly cold nights, even though everyone knew the house was deserted. Others mentioned faint lights in the windows, that characteristic yellowish glow of candles appearing and disappearing like fireflies on a summer night. An experienced trapper named Jacob Sterling reported taking shelter near the house during a severe snowstorm in February 1871. He swore he heard music coming from inside, a soft melody played on a piano, although everyone knew there were no musical instruments in that building. When the storm passed and he approached to investigate, he found only silence and locked doors, with untouched snow piled up on the porch, with no sign that anyone had been there recently. These accounts fueled conversations during the long winter months, when families gathered around hearths and shared stories to ward off the cold and boredom. Ezekiel Thorne's house began to take on a life of its own in popular narratives, transforming into something more than simply the residence of a tormented man. It became a symbol of the Appalachian Mountains, a reminder of how isolation and loss could distort the human mind in ways that defied comprehension. In his notes from March 1871, Pastor Blackwood reflected on the nature of the case. He wrote that Ezekiel Thorne was not a bad or dangerous man, but rather someone who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control and who had found a peculiar way to survive the pain. The 6 candles were not symbols of something sinister, but rather of persistent love and a refusal to let go of those we love, even when reason tells us we should move on. The spring of 1871 brought with it the thaw of the mountains, and with it, a renewed curiosity about the fate of Ezekiel Thorne. The mystery of his disappearance remained unsolved, and theories proliferated among the inhabitants of the region. Some believed that he had simply left for another state, seeking a fresh start where no one knew his story. Others suspected that the mountains had reclaimed his body, that he had gotten lost in some deep valley, or fallen off a cliff during one of his solitary walks. Pastor Blackwood, now completely absorbed by the documentation of this extraordinary case, decided to organize a more comprehensive expedition to the property. This time he brought with him not only law enforcement representatives, but also a scholar of human behavior from the University of Tennessee, a man named Professor Henry Whitmore, who had demonstrated academic interest in the psychological manifestations of extreme trauma and loss. Professor Whitmore was a meticulous individual, known for his detailed observations and scientific approach to phenomena that many would consider simply madness. He had studied similar cases in other parts of the country, documenting how different individuals reacted to catastrophic losses and how the human mind sometimes created extraordinary defense mechanisms to cope with unbearable realities. When the group arrived at the property in April, they found the house exactly as it had been left months before, but with clear signs of the harsh winter. Some windows had shattered under the weight of the snow, allowing natural elements to invade the interior. Dry leaves accumulated in the corners, small animals had made nests in some rooms, and dampness was beginning to stain the walls with dark patterns that looked like maps of unexplored territories. Professor Whitmore spent days examining every detail of the residence, making extensive notes in his hardcover notebooks. He studied the figures on the beds with the attention of an archaeologist, documenting the materials used, the construction techniques, and the level of detail. He was particularly fascinated by how Thorne had used real human hair in the constructions, likely collected over years from preserved hairstyles, a common practice in Victorian times, where locks of hair were kept as mementos of loved ones. Thorne's diary became the object of intensive study. Whitmore spent entire nights reading and rereading the entries, mapping the progression of the man's mental state over the decades. He identified clear patterns, periods of lucidity where Thorne recognized his situation, followed by long stretches where fantasy and reality blended indistinguishably. The professor noted that the most confused entries coincided with death anniversaries, suggesting that significant dates triggered deeper regressions into the protective illusion Thorne had constructed. A particularly revealing discovery was a set of unsent letters found in a secret drawer in his office. They were addressed to each of his 6 sisters, written at different times over the years. In them, Thorne recounted events from his life, shared thoughts and concerns, and asked for advice on trivial decisions. It was as if he maintained a continuous correspondence with people he knew, at some deep level of consciousness, would never read his words. The letters revealed a far more complex man than initial accounts suggested. He demonstrated awareness of his condition at times, writing about how he knew he was conversing with shadows, but that this was preferable to the absolute silence of solitude. In a particularly moving letter to his sister Sarah, he wrote about how the pain of loss had transformed into something different over the years, no longer a sharp wound, but rather a constant companion, almost comforting in its familiarity. Professor Whitmore also discovered evidence that Thorne had not remained completely isolated during all those years. There were records of purchases in nearby towns, receipts for commercial transactions dating from different periods. He bought fabrics, candles in large quantities, decorative objects, always paying in cash and never staying long enough to engage in meaningful conversation. The merchants who knew him described him as polite but distant, always in a hurry to return to the mountains. Particularly intriguing was the discovery of a series of sketches found in a notebook, hidden under the mattress of one of the beds in the attic. They were hand-drawn sketches depicting scenes of everyday life, women preparing meals, sewing, reading, conversing with each other. The artistic quality was surprising, showing a natural talent that Thorne apparently possessed but had never formally developed. Each drawing was dated and accompanied by small notes describing the scene as if it were a real memory. Whitmore theorized that Thorne used multiple forms of expression to keep the memories of her sisters alive. The physical figures were three-dimensional representations, the candles were symbols of continuous presence, the drawings were captured moments, and the diary was a record of a shared life that existed only in her imagination. It was a complex system of memory preservation, an elaborate architecture of denial and celebration simultaneously. During the investigation, the group also found a small, makeshift cemetery at the back of the property, hidden among dense trees. These weren't human graves, but rather 6 carefully carved wooden crosses, each marking the spot where Thorne had buried personal belongings of each sister. Careful excavations revealed metal boxes containing books, jewelry, original letters, photographs, all meticulously preserved and protected from moisture. It was as if he had created a double sanctuary, one for the living representations of his sisters within the house, and another for the actual relics of their past lives outside. Pastor Blackwood arranged interviews with all the merchants who had had contact with Thorne over the years. A fabric salesman in Crossville recalled occasional conversations where Thorne mentioned buying materials for his sisters. When the merchant commented that it would be a pleasure to meet them someday, Thorne simply smiled and said that they preferred the privacy of the mountains, that the outside world frightened and confused them. A woman who ran a small candle shop in Sparta recalled that Thorne was her best customer, buying dozens of candles monthly. She had once asked him why he needed so many, and he replied with disconcerting sincerity that each flame was a prayer, a way to keep the light burning against the darkness that constantly threatened to engulf his home. The woman said there was something in his eyes at that moment, a depth of sadness that made her never question his purchases again. Professor Whitmore spent weeks compiling all the information into a comprehensive study of the case. He argued that Ezekiel Thorne represented a fascinating example of how the human mind can create alternative realities when confronted with losses that exceed its capacity to process. It wasn't madness in the traditional sense he proposed, but rather an extreme form of psychological survival mechanism. Thorne had essentially chosen to live in 2 worlds simultaneously, one where he acknowledged his sisters' deaths, and another where they continued to exist through his will and dedication. The study also explored the broader implications of extreme geographic isolation. In the Appalachian Mountains, where communities lived separated by significant distances and social interaction was limited, it was possible for someone like Thorne to maintain his alternative reality for decades without outside intervention. In a larger city, with close neighbors and stricter social expectations, his condition would have been identified and possibly treated much sooner. But in the quiet heights of Tennessee, he found the perfect space for his pain to manifest itself without restraint. In May 1871, after months of intensive investigation, the general consensus was that Ezekiel Thorne had likely gone deep into the mountains and met his end there, either by accident or by deliberate choice to reunite with his sisters in the only way left to him. Searches were organized throughout the most remote valleys, but the vast dimensions of the Appalachians made it impossible to cover the entire territory. There were thousands of ravines, caves, and densely forested areas where a body could disappear without a trace. The property was eventually acquired by the county, with plans to dismantle it and use the wood for other constructions. But something curious happened. Each worker assigned to the task found reasons to postpone it. Tools broke inexplicably. The weather became unfavorable. Minor accidents occurred frequently enough to discourage the work. It wasn't superstition exactly, but rather a collective discomfort in dismantling what had clearly been a memorial of love, however disturbing its manifestation might have been. The years that followed transformed the House of 6 Candles into something more than just an abandoned property in the Tennessee mountains. It became part of local folklore, a story told on winter nights, a tangible reminder of how love and loss can shape human destiny in unpredictable ways. Pastor Blackwood continued to keep his meticulous records, now not only of the known facts, but also of the countless stories and legends that began to develop around the place. In 1873, a young Nashville journalist named Thomas Brennan heard about the case and decided to write a series of articles for the Daily American newspaper. He spent weeks in the area, interviewing everyone who had had any contact with Ezekiel Thorne, visiting the property multiple times, and delving into the archives that Pastor Blackwood had compiled. His articles, published over several months, brought national attention to the story, and soon people from different states began to express interest. Brennan was a skilled writer, able to capture not only the facts of the case, but also the melancholic atmosphere that permeated the entire narrative. He described the Appalachian Mountains with poetic language, painting a portrait of a region where time seemed to flow differently, where the vastness of nature allowed extraordinary stories to unfold far from the eyes of the civilized world. His articles avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on the human dimension of Thorne's tragedy. One of the aspects that Brennan explored extensively was the nature of grief in post-Civil War America. He contextualized Thorne's story within a time when death was a constant presence in people's lives. The war had left hundreds of thousands of families broken, widows and orphans scattered throughout the country. Epidemics of typhoid fever, cholera and other diseases regularly swept through entire communities. Life expectancy was significantly lower, and almost everyone knew intimately the pain of losing loved ones prematurely. In this context, Brennan argued, Ezekiel Thorne was not a complete aberration, but rather an extreme manifestation of feelings that many shared but expressed in more conventional ways. The Victorian era was known for its elaborate mourning rituals, for jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, for post-mortem photographs, for extended periods of black dress and social isolation after losses. Thorne had simply taken these practices to a point where the line between appropriate remembrance and denial of reality had completely dissolved. The articles generated a significant response from readers. Letters arrived at the newspaper's editorial office sharing similar though less extreme stories. A woman from Virginia wrote about her uncle, who kept his deceased wife's room exactly as she had left it, untouched for 20 years. A man from Kentucky reported knowing a neighbor who spoke daily to the portrait of his son, who had died in the war. Another letter described a lady who prepared 2 cups of tea every afternoon, one for herself and one for her sister, who had died decades earlier. These letters revealed that Thorne's case, though extreme, touched on something universally human, the difficulty of accepting that those we love have truly left and will never return. The journalist compiled some of these correspondences into subsequent articles, creating a collective portrait of a nation still processing massive losses and seeking ways to maintain connections with those who had departed. During this period, Professor Whitmore published his complete academic study of the case in a fledgling psychology journal. The work, titled Architectures of Memory and Manifestations of Pathological Grief, became a reference in academic circles interested in human behavior. Whitmore proposed that Thorne's mind had created what he called a preserved reality, a psychological state where past and present coexisted through carefully maintained rituals and symbols. The professor also speculated about the role of the physical environment in maintaining this alternative reality. The isolated house in the mountains functioned as a kind of temporal bubble, a place where the normal rules of society did not apply, and where Thorne could live his fantasy without constant interruptions that would force him to confront reality. He compared this to historical cases of voluntary seclusion, where individuals chose to completely separate themselves from society to pursue visions or ideas that would not be accepted in the outside world. In 1875, an unexpected discovery added a new layer to the mystery. A group of explorers mapping caves in the region found, in a rock formation approximately 15 kilometers from Thorne's house, evidence that someone had spent considerable time there. There were signs of ancient campfires, markings on the walls that seemed to indicate counts of days, and remains of provisions dating back several years. Most significantly, they found carved into the limestone a set of 6 names: Sarah, Elizabeth, Catherine, Margaret, Rebecca, and Caroline. The cave offered spectacular views of the valley below, but was difficult to access, requiring climbing over unstable rocks and intimate knowledge of the local geography. Explorers theorized that Thorne might have used the place as a temporary refuge during his final days, perhaps seeking even greater solitude or a place with spiritual significance. More detailed searches of the cave and surrounding areas were conducted, but no further trace was found. If Thorne had indeed been there, he had left without giving any clues to his final destination. Reverend Blackwood, now elderly and in poor health, made one last visit to the estate in 1876. He was compiling his decades of notes into a single volume, a complete historical record of the case that he hoped to preserve for future generations. During this final visit, he reflected on how his understanding of the story had evolved over the years. Initially, he had seen Ezekiel Thorne as a disturbed, possibly dangerous man, certainly in need of intervention, but with time and greater understanding, he came to see something different. Blackwood wrote in his concluding notes that Thorne represented a profound philosophical question about the nature of reality and sanity. If a man lives alone in the mountains, bothering no one, but maintaining an inner reality dramatically different from the outer one, who had the right to judge him insane? At what point does eccentricity become pathology? And more importantly, if his delusion brought him comfort and allowed him to continue living after a tragedy that could have completely destroyed him, wasn't there a wisdom in this? A form of survival that the medicine and psychology of the time did not yet adequately understand. The pastor also documented changes he had observed in the house over the years. The structure was slowly deteriorating under the weight of time and the elements, but curiously, the 6 figures remained relatively preserved. The fabrics that covered them had darkened and become fragile, but the structures themselves retained their form. The candles, of course, were never lit again, but their remains stayed on the pedestals as silent witnesses to rituals repeated thousands of times over decades. Something that intrigued Blackwood was how the house was beginning to be viewed by the local community, not with fear or revulsion, but with a kind of melancholic respect. Young couples occasionally made the walk there, saying they wanted to see the monument to brotherly love with their own eyes. Some left small offerings on the porch, wildflowers, interesting stones, small objects that seemed to function as symbols of their own losses and memories. In 1878, a proposal was made by a group of Nashville preservationists to restore and maintain the property as a kind of memorial. The idea was controversial. Some argued that it would be morbid to turn the site into an attraction, exploiting one man's tragedy for entertainment. Others argued that the story had educational and cultural value and that preserving it would help future generations understand aspects of human experience that were often hidden or ignored. The debate attracted attention from newspapers in multiple states. Letters to the editor passionately argued both sides. A Boston doctor wrote that the house should be preserved as an example of how society needs to improve its care for those suffering from mental afflictions. An Ohio professor argued that Thorne's story was an important reminder of the dangers of social isolation and the importance of strong communities. A Civil War veteran in Pennsylvania saw in the narrative a reflection of his own struggle to process the loss of fellow soldiers. Eventually, the proposal was rejected due to practical and financial reasons. The remote location made regular maintenance extremely difficult and costly. There were no adequate roads to safely bring visitors, and building them would require substantial investment that no institution was willing to make. The decision was to leave the house to the elements, allowing nature to eventually reclaim the structure, slowly transforming it from a physical building into pure memory and narrative. During the 1880s, as the Appalachian region saw slow but steady development, with new roads and population growth, the house became increasingly accessible. Occasional visitors made the journey, some out of morbid curiosity, others out of genuine interest in history. Graffiti began to appear on the walls, some respectful, some not. Vandals eventually removed smaller objects as souvenirs. The 6 figures, however, remained untouched, as if a tacit agreement existed among all visitors that this, at the very least, should be respected. As the 19th century drew to a close, the story of the House of 6 Candles had transformed into something far greater than the actual events that gave rise to it. It had become a living legend, told and retold in endless variations, each narrator adding their own details, their own interpretations, their own theories about what really happened in those dark Tennessee mountains. The line between fact and fiction had become as thin as the mist that eternally shrouded the Appalachian peaks at dawn. Travelers passing through the region reported increasingly varied and unverifiable experiences. Some swore they had heard female voices singing in ethereal harmonies during full moon nights. Others mentioned seeing silhouettes in the windows of the abandoned house, figures that moved slowly from one room to another, as if still performing domestic routines from decades past. There were those who claimed to have found freshly lit candles on their stands, their flames dancing gently even in the absence of any wind, defying all logical explanation. An experienced hunter recounted a night when he got lost on the trails during a severe storm. He described how he ended up taking shelter near the property, and during the darkest hours of the early morning, he was absolutely certain he saw a golden light emanating from the windows. It wasn't the faint flickering glow of candles, but something more intense, warmer, as if the interior of the house were filled with a luminosity that didn't belong to this world. When the storm passed and he approached at dawn, he found only the familiar, empty structure, silent and cold as it had always been. A family that established a farm a few kilometers away during the early 1890s recounted experiences that became part of the region's enduring folklore. They described nights when the wind blew from a specific direction, carrying with it sounds they couldn't explain. These weren't the normal noises of the forest or nocturnal wildlife, but something that seemed almost human, almost recognizable, like fragments of distant conversations or laughter muffled by distance and time. The children of this family grew up hearing stories about the lonely man who had lived in that house, the man who loved his sisters with such deep intensity that not even death could break that bond. The children developed a respectful fascination with the property, occasionally making expeditions there during the day, always in groups, never alone. They described a peculiar feeling that permeated the place, not exactly fear, but a tangible melancholy that seemed to permeate the very wooden planks and foundation stones. As the new century approached, bringing with it technological and social changes that would radically transform the world, the House of the Six Candles remained a temporal anchor, a piece of the past preserved not by deliberate effort, but by a combination of remote location, collective respect, and perhaps something else inexplicable. The structure continued its inevitable deterioration, but surprisingly slowly, as if resisting the passage of time with a stubbornness that mirrored Ezekiel Thorne's own stubbornness in accepting the loss of his sisters. Occasional researchers continued to visit the site, each seeking to understand different aspects of the story. Anthropologists studied the narrative as an example of mourning rituals in isolated communities. Psychologists saw the case as an illustration of mental defense mechanisms against trauma. Writers found inspiration in the combination of love, loss, and obsession that permeated every detail of the story. Artists sketched the decaying house, attempting to capture the unique atmosphere of the place on their canvases. A young Boston writer who visited the property in 1897 described the experience in her personal diary, later published by her family decades after her death. She wrote about how walking through the empty rooms had awakened in her a visceral understanding of human loneliness, of how each of us carries losses that fundamentally shape who we become. The six figures, now covered in dust and cobwebs but still recognizable, provoked in her profound reflections on the nature of love and memory. The writer speculated in her notes whether Ezekiel Thorne had truly been mad or extraordinarily sane in a way that conventional society couldn't recognize. She questioned whether creating a world where those we love never truly depart was fundamentally different from the more accepted ways of keeping memories alive through photographs, stories, and rituals. The difference, she concluded, was only one of degree, not of kind. We all build shrines to our dead, some in corners of our minds, others in family albums, and Thorne had simply built his in wood and wax, in fabric and hair, in candles burning against the darkness. During the first decades of the 20th century, as America rapidly modernized, the story of the House of the Six Candles took on new significance. In an era of dizzying change, where ancient traditions were quickly replaced by new ways of living and thinking, Thorne's narrative represented something that was being lost, a deep connection to the past, a refusal to let the march of progress completely erase those who came before. There was something almost noble, some argued, in his unwavering dedication, even if manifested in unconventional ways. The house itself continued to attract sporadic visitors, each leaving their mark in subtle ways. Some wrote messages on the walls, not vulgar graffiti, but thoughtful reflections on loss, love, and memory. Others left small objects as offerings, creating over the years an eclectic collection of tributes: dried flowers, polished stones, folded letters addressed to deceased loved ones, photographs of unknown people, small candles that would never be lit, but symbolized the intention to keep some light burning against oblivion. Eventually, the physical structure of the house began to give way more significantly. Parts of the roof collapsed during particularly severe storms. Entire sections of walls rotted and fell, opening the interior to the elements. Nature slowly reclaimed the space, with vines invading through broken windows, moss covering the floorboards, and small trees sprouting between loose boards. It was as if the Appalachian Mountains were gradually embracing the building, drawing it back into themselves, transforming something man-made into part of the natural landscape once more. The six figures on the beds remained surprisingly intact for longer than any engineer or architect could have predicted. Even when the roof above them disappeared completely, Exposing them directly to the elements, they retained their basic forms, as if Thorne's own dedication had imbued his creations with supernatural durability. Visitors in the 1930s and 1940s still reported being able to clearly identify the 6 silhouettes, although increasingly integrated with natural elements, covered in lichens and serving as shelter for small birds that built nests among the dry branches. As for Ezekiel Thorne himself, his ultimate fate remained a mystery that was never definitively solved. There was no record of his death. No marked grave, no body discovered. He simply faded into the vastness of the Appalachians, becoming part of the very mountain he had chosen as home for his grief and devotion. Some believed he had walked into the depths of the forest in a final act of symbolic reunion with his sisters. Others speculated that perhaps he had departed for another distant place, finally seeking peace, or perhaps beginning the entire ritual again in some even more remote location. There were also those who preferred to believe in something more poetic, that Thorne never truly left, that somehow his presence remained intertwined with that place, that the lights occasionally seen in the windows were not illusions or reflections, but rather a manifestation of a devotion so intense that it transcended the normal limitations of physical existence. It was fantasy, certainly, but fantasy that revealed something true about the human need to believe that love strong enough can, somehow, overcome even the finitude that defines our mortal experience. The story of the House of Six Candles has become, over generations, more than just a narrative about an eccentric man in the Tennessee mountains. It has transformed into a meditation on universal themes that resonate across cultures and eras: the difficulty of accepting loss, the power of memory, the fine line between devotion and obsession, the human capacity to create meaning and purpose even in the loneliest and most desperate circumstances. It was a story that each person interpreted through the prism of their own experiences with loss and love. Today, little more than a stone foundation and a few sturdy vertical posts remain of the property, but the place is still known to locals. Occasionally, adventurous hikers make the journey there, driven more by curiosity about the legend than by any expectation of finding anything tangible. What they discover is a tranquil place, covered by a forest that slowly erases all traces of human presence, yet still carrying an atmosphere that makes people pause, reflect, remember their own losses, and the ways, large or small, in which they keep alive the memories of those they loved. Ezekiel Thorne's 6 candles have long since been extinguished, consumed by time and the elements. But the light they represented, the refusal to let the darkness of oblivion completely engulf those we love, continues to burn in countless ways and in innumerable places. Each of us keeps our own flames burning in our hearts and minds, illuminating the faces of those who have departed but who never truly leave us. And perhaps in the end, that is the true legacy of the House of the 6 Candles. Not the eccentricity of a tormented man, but the reminder that true love knows no bounds, not even those imposed by death. If this journey through the shadows of Appalachia touched you in any way, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories exploring the darkest and most fascinating corners of the human experience. Comment below telling us which part of this narrative impacted you the most, or share your own reflections on memory, loss, and the